she didn't see that on TV and get really upset about it. During the time that Yugoslavia was falling apart, Turkey was using U.S. arms to massacre tons of Kurds, like tens and tens of thousands of Kurds. Like, apparently that was also not in the U.S. media to make her upset. So she doesn't ever ask the question, like why is this the stuff that is being presented to us to be upset about?
And it's tough because, if nobody outside of, Elliot Abrams, the last guy we talked about, nobody really likes massacres and would prefer it if, countries didn't do them, or if, in some vague way, if we're a very powerful, wealthy country that could stop, these people from being killed, shouldn't we do it? What are the lessons Samantha Powers draws from, is it that we should always err on the side of action when it comes to, stopping these kind of dramatic human rights abuses, but only in very specific areas that, NATO and the national security elites think are important?
She never is explicit about this. She I look at this and I think of the section in Lord of the Rings when Sam gets to carry the ring for a short period of time, if you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Yeah. So beautifully enough, she goes by Sam. Everybody calls her Sam instead of Samantha. And so if you go and look at that passage, referring to Sam, it fits her perfectly, where all of a sudden he has in his hands the power to do right, to vanquish evildoers. And he just has to put on the ring and it can all be his. And I think that, that's a really interesting and kind of profound piece of writing about how power seduces us, not just by playing on our worst instincts, but by playing on our best instincts, like wanting to help other people. And she doesn't ever seem to have very deeply considered that.
And how does she view NATO intervention in the Balkans as kind of as a test case for, or a model for how the United States and its allies should comport itself going forward?
Well, she definitely wanted the United States to do something. From a certain perspective, she thought even what the United States did was too little, too late. And then she ended up, of course, in the White House. And when she was in the White House, during our overthrow of the Libyan government, she was there. She hadn't left for the UN yet. She was in the room when it happens. But she's not as gung-ho about that anymore. And what she wants us to know about Libya is lots of people said that I was one of the people pushing for that. That's not really true. And also lots of bad things have happened since, but they probably would have happened anyway.
Right. So a problem from hell sort of sets up her her moral vision for foreign policy, but only does so by, these vast and glaring omissions. She just edits that out of her consciousness, or just doesn't present it as part of a case for how to understand how U.S. policy functions. And then basically she repeats that exact same technique in her memoir, where she just doesn't talk about these huge glaring issues that were not things that were taking place in the world that she was witnessing, but things that were taking place during the Obama administration that she was part of and actually an active participant in. So in a way, it's even worse.
It is incredible. It is exactly the same thing as A Problem from Hell. In her book, in her new memoir, she doesn't say anything about Obama's massive campaign of drone strikes. She says nothing about Israel bombing Gaza during the time she was there. And there were 3 main bombing campaigns and, who knows how many other minor ones. There's nothing about the Saudi war on Yemen, which is truly as grotesque as the Syrian war. And the United States, it would not happen without the United States. There's nothing about talking about Yugoslavia. So purportedly, this is the place where she learned about the world and why the United States had to do good. She doesn't mention this crazy fact, which I've never heard anybody anywhere talk about, which is that during the Obama administration, the Prime Minister of Kosovo came to visit the White House. And Joe Biden met with him, and there's a picture of the two of them being super chummy in front of a portrait of George Washington. And Joe Biden called him the George Washington of Kosovo. Well, he'd been head of the Kosovo Liberation Army during the 1990s. and the Council of Europe, which is a group of like just boring bureaucrats who do not go out on a limb and make claims that are not fully documented. The KLA, like they were involved in huge amounts of coke. I guess it was heroin smuggling in Europe during that time to make money. And that's all, that's standard in wars like that. But the KLA was also killing prisoners of war and selling their organs. This is the guy, the Council of Europe referred to it as like kind of less a army and more of a mafia. This guy was in charge of that, of the killing people and selling organs. And Joe Biden is there in the White House with him. And this is supposedly like she's super into the Balkans. She's really interested in that. That does not come up.
I want to go into the examples of Libya and Yemen, and her roles in both of those things, and like why the fact that she doesn't bring them up in her memoir is so galling. But another thing that she doesn't mention at all in her memoir is she doesn't describe anything about her very sort of chummy, friendly relationship with Henry Kissinger. Does he show up? Does he show up at all in the book? Does she talk about going to Yankees games with him, receiving an award named after him, being given to her by him?
Well, who among us can say we haven't been to a Yankees game with a war criminal? I mean, it is incredible. He appears nowhere. Like, I had to get the Kindle edition of the book so I could search it and make sure that I hadn't missed anything, like any Kissinger reference. But no, obviously he's one of the 20th century's premier war criminals, and I guess they're buddies now. Like they did go to this Yankees game. She didn't try to cover it up. She tweeted it.
Oh no, they had pictures. She was sharing it on the timeline. She can't not be aware of how people view Henry Kissinger and how, I don't know, hypocritical it is for her as like the human rights premier human rights warrior in the American government to be seen having such a close friendship with this guy. She can't not be aware of that, but she must just not care, or she doesn't see it that way.
To be fair, though, none of the war crimes that Henry Kissinger was directly responsible for ended up on American television, so she might not know about them.
It is like she kind of like jokes about it. Like she doesn't say this exactly, but it's like, look at us, we sure are an odd couple. But she's never addressed it as far as I know. And I guess just once you get to that level of U.S. foreign policy, you understand how hard it is to make these difficult decisions. I mean,
this is also something you mentioned in your review, where like it's sort of like this idea that like, okay, to wear the ring of power, so like to get in the position of UN ambassador or on the National Security Council, where you're in the room making the decisions to save these thousands of people or end this famine, et cetera, do the good that you want to do in the world. It's sort of like there's an understanding that, well, like to do that, you also, are going to have to torture some folks. You're also going to have to kiss the ring of Saudi Arabia and let them do, all of their atrocities. If you want to save the other atrocities, like you're going to have to let some other atrocities happen as well. And like, that's just, look, it's a complicated world. And like, that's just the way it is. And like, you either can complain about it or you can try to do the good that you can do in the world.
Yeah. And, honestly, I do think that if she had been honest about this, about the trade-offs as she saw them, like it could have been an unbelievably interesting book. And I do think that like it's kind of easy for us because I think the chances are pretty good. Like none of us are ever going to be the U.S. ambassador to the UN. We don't have to ever think about these questions. And like people like us also just don't have to think about the world in general. Like how should the world work? How would you restructure the UN? Would you have some sort of like supranational force that would go around the world trying to say like these are questions that we never have to think about. And as long as we live, like the world will be so far away from that. Like it'll be kind of irrelevant. But for somebody like her, like it is interesting. Like, was it worth it to her? And as I say, like she was absolutely complicit in evil. There's no question about that. But she also talks about like maybe having stopped a genocide in the Central African Republic before it started. And she also was helping organize like the U.S. response, leading an international response to an outbreak of Ebola. And if she hadn't been willing to do these terrible things, she never would have been there. And like that would be an amazing book to hear from somebody who's like there in the room and is making the case for why it was worth it or why it wasn't. And she doesn't do it. And so it's just like unbelievably boring.
I think part of that is because if you gave away the game that way and said, there's no virtuous way to do this because we're administering this global empire, it's going to require tough choices by definition, because, you know, we have all these stakeholders in all these different regions and they have their specific on the ground aims, and we have to support them or else, you know, somebody else is going to come in. If you're making that pitch, if you're making that realpolitik argument about how power really works, it kind of undermines your idea that America is inherently virtuous and that America's foreign policy actions have an inherent virtuosity to them. And that is one of the key propaganda buttons they press in order to get people on board for the next time they need to intervene somewhere.
You also couldn't call the book an education of an idealist.
Yeah.
It would have to be like The Cynic's Guide to Power or something like that. Like The Cynic's Guide to Doing Good in the World or some bullshit like that.
You know, one of the things, like, you know, right off the bat that it's not going to be very interesting because she never talks about the fact that her last name is Power. Like, it really is. It's like somebody
It's like
is writing a book.
Dickens character or something.
Yeah, like I've always thought that about her, like Anna Marie Slaughter. If you know who she is, like, she's another
of course,
person of this type. And like, it really is like somebody writing a book, and it's like this is my memoir about my life and what I've done. And my last name is Cruelty. My first name Vicious. And I ended up as like China's chief torturer. And so I just take people apart piece by piece. And what's that you're saying? It's kind of ironic that I have that. I'd never seen it like that before.
Or like
cruelty.
The opposite. Like, you know, I read a memoir about like a lifetime of upholding law and order. My name, Bob Crime Man.
Yeah, exactly. So like, she just never talks about that. And that lets you know like who she is right from the beginning.
So, you know, in this memoir, like in the specific examples of, you know, of when she was in power and, you know, she had her hand, like, you know, at the switch, she was in the room making these decisions. The big one, of course, is Libya. Because you talk about like what her role was in the Obama administration's intervention in Libya.
Well, there's her version of it, which appears in this book. And then the coverage just in the New York Times and the Washington Post and elsewhere at the time and since. Like, at the time, the reporting was about how she was one of the main supporters of the U.S. intervening in Libya, which of course meant that we were going to overthrow the Libyan government, even though we were pretending at the time that that's not what was going to happen. And Hillary Clinton was also reported to be one of the big supporters of that.
She was this was in the first Obama administration when Clinton was Secretary of State.
Yeah, that's right.
And this was like their first big attempt to like use American power under a new kind of like enlightened liberal democratic regime. And again, like as I remember, the justification for that was, of course, to prevent genocide from occurring in the city of Benghazi. Because the idea was like if the U.S. you know or like NATO Air Force or like if we don't start bombing, then Gaddafi's forces are going to like you know flood into the rebel city of Benghazi and they're just going to slaughter everyone there, and we need to stop that from happening. Like you know if you could press a button literally to stop a genocide from happening, you know wouldn't you do it?
Right, exactly. And at the time, everybody was saying that you know she was one of the main proponents. Power was. Things haven't gone super well since then in Libya, and she's not especially eager in her memoir to have her name attached to it. And so she does talk about how it's like, oh, well, you know, my influence, my input has been exaggerated in news coverage. And like, if you just look at the political situation, it wasn't going to be going back to the status quo. Like, if we didn't do anything, Libya was going to fall apart anyway. Lots and lots of people would have died anyway. So don't blame me. Like that is pretty much what she has to say. Although she does have something else like I've never seen anywhere, which is very interesting to me, is that at the time she says like they were there in the room and people were telling Obama, you know, if we overthrow the Libyan government after Libya gave up its rudimentary nuclear program during the Bush administration.
That was like listeners in the show